Well, very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adam Parker. As Byron says, I'm a part-time PhD student at the Open University investigating the archaeology of magic in Roman Britain. And pretty much every time I've spoken at the Roman Finds Group, I've introduced myself saying that, but I'm hoping this is the last time because I'm finally finishing at the end of this year. Happy days. One of the elements of ancient magic that I've been investigating is the amuletic use of sexual imagery, in particular the use of phallic imagery for this function in the ancient world. It's become something of a research interest of mine, and so I'm setting the scene for the subsequent papers in this seminar by providing an overview of the theme of phallic imagery in Roman art and archaeology. In my time with you this evening, I'm going to discuss the apotropaic nature of this image in the ancient world, and then go through a very whistle-stop tour of some of the key types and forms of phallic object. However, first thing first, it gives me very great pleasure to wish you all a very happy Phallus Thursday. The Phallus Thursday hashtag, it's a weekly social media event in which contributors on Twitter in particular post images about ancient or historical phallic things. LJ Trafford started it a while ago now. It's mainly on Twitter, exists on other platforms like Instagram. If you know of it on other social media, do let me know about it because I don't know it on there. And the point of this all of this kind of gratuitous imagery turning up weekly in social media, if there is a point, is to highlight the kind of ubiquity of these sorts of images in the ancient world. Whereas a lot of modern viewers often think of these manifestations as bizarre at best and sometimes even offensive, these connotations are very much anachronistic. By highlighting both the absurdity and prominence of phallic imagery in this way, it helps to lessen the sensationalism around it, and it brings it more into the scholarly mainstream. And also importantly into the public heritage mainstream. So it also lets us spend a Thursday evening talking about it at the RFG, so win-win from my point of view. It'd be great to get anybody who is on Twitter getting involved with the hashtag, and do tag me in it on it as well. So let's move forward. This seminar is very much focused on phallic iconography. This is often conflated with erotic imagery in the ancient world, which is the first myth that I'm going to be busting this evening. Erotic imagery was very definitely a thing in the ancient world, no doubt about it. Look at the image on your screen. But depictions of embodied and mostly human couples having at it probably served a very different function to images and jewelry depicting disembodied phalli. Contextually, they're also found in different sorts of places. Occasionally, a tradition is repeated that phallic carvings and other imagery might point towards brothels in Pompeii to try and link the two things together, but that is very definitely a phallic fallacy. So we are looking at disembodied phallic things, not images for erotic purposes. The research and study of sexual imagery, and particularly phallic imagery, isn't really particularly old. There are a few antiquarian papers and books about it, but these often apply anthropological methodologies and cross-cultural analysis. So really the magnum opus on the subject is Catherine John's 1982 Sex or Symbol, which remains an absolute core text on the subject. Note in particular chapter 3, the phallus and the eye, as a starting point for any research on this topic. Thankfully, the study hasn't wholly languished in the 1980s. New approaches, interpretations, and discoveries keep moving the subject forward, some of which you're going to hear after my talk. I will draw your attention in particular to 2020's Un-Roman Sex as a shining light on this subject. Now, neither of these two books on the screen focus explicitly on phallic imagery, and nor should they have done. So to help any future investigations in this, I've started compiling a bibliography on Roman and phallic topics. There's various caveats needed for this, but they're all visible on the link, so take a screenshot or I'll stick it in the chat at the end of it. It's going to be a dynamic, unfinished bibliography, so I'll welcome any additions to it after the end of this, and I hope it proves useful moving forward. So let's get to the subject at hand. Part of ancient mythology involves a belief in the supernatural manifestation of bad luck, the malus oculus, the evil eye, as beautifully exemplified here by the Eye of Sauron. It could be a source of ill health, poor fortune, malignancy. The evil eye was both personified in Roman art as a disembodied eye and thought of as something that people could, usually unknowingly, pass on to others through their own actions. Much like the Eye of Sauron in the franchise, he was always looking for the powerful, shiny one ring. The ancient evil eye, the attention of the Roman evil eye could be sought by arrogance, by hubris, by riches, and it also sought out the weak and vulnerable. Where its gaze fell, bad stuff happened, is what it boils down to, as demonstrated quite amply by Mr. Frodo. In this scene, the Eye of Sauron falls on him and he literally falls over. It's kind of a suitable analogy for the effects of the evil eye in the ancient world. Where the phallus comes into this is that in ancient art, it is depicted as one of the enemies of the evil eye. In all cases, the phallus imagery here is quite deliberately bizarre, weird, or unconventional, all the better to try and attract the gaze of the evil eye. The other enemies of the eye are various animals of air, land, and sea, and for obvious reason, weapons. If we draw attention to the mosaic in the top left, we have a macrophallic dwarf facing away from it, but his phallus is pointing towards the eye, and it's surrounded by a raven, a trident, a sword, centipede, a snake, a dog, etc. By depicting phallic victory over the evil eye, and in the bottom left, this is really quite exemplified by two phallic dudes sawing an eye in half, it reinforced its very function. The phallus defeats the evil eye by fixing its gaze and preventing it from falling on vulnerable people. Generally, this means that we can call phallic things and images amulets, and that they thus served an apotropaic function. Now, my research focuses on Roman Britain, so that's all where my data is going to be at. It sort of depends exactly on how you define an amulet, but I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say from my data set that they are the most common and were the most widely spread amulet in Roman Britain. And almost certainly also that's almost certainly true for Northwest provinces as well. Let's get to some archaeology stuff. This table is a division of the 451 phallic objects from Roman Britain that I have recorded up until the end of 2019. That number is now a little bit higher, but that's kind of my PhD data set. In raw figures, it's clear that the most commonly encountered type of phallic object in Britain was a pendant in copper alloy, though they are made out of other materials. So we have pendants, and then we have mounts, and then we have carvings, and these three things together take up most of the phallic imagery in the province. One thing just to point out though, on this little table is on the far right hand side, there is the image of roundel, which only has a couple of them in it. The phallic roundels that Stephen is going to be talking about later on are here included in the pendant part of my data set. It's just an artifact of the data gathering that they are counted as slightly different things. But if you see lots of roundels later on, that's why. It's certainly clear within this pendant class that there are several different forms that it's going to take. I haven't bottomed out exactly which were the most common yet, as the form or typology isn't really part of my PhD work, but I will shamelessly refer you to the RFG datasheet 11 I produced on this very topic, with a caveat that the suggested different forms suggested within it are very broad brush. And we're going to go through some of them and some other things as well. So very broadly, on phallic pendants, which is the most common time of the most common amulet, there are bigger ones and there were littler ones as well. I strongly suspect that these were intended to be suspended from different places. The majority, as far as I can tell, are the two types depicted at the top of the screen, an iphyphallic or erect phallus, straight or slightly curving with testes at the base, below or behind a suspension loop. I recorded 117 examples of copper alloy phallic pendants. And what we can say about these is that materials were important. When they were original, these green copper alloys were going to be bright and brassy colors, shining things, big conspicuous things designed to catch the gaze of the evil eye. I don't think that the copper alloy ones are meant to be imitating gold examples, because gold ones are really very rare. There's only three examples of them known from Roman Britain, and they take a different shape. In the center of the screen there, with kind of hollowed out drop pendants. There's a few similar ones from the continent on the right-hand side there, which look broadly similar to the Romano-British ones, but they're very, very rare, and they're also much smaller. I know I have mentioned this particular paper at the RFG before, but I have to make a note of this paper because I think it really is super important in trying to understand what phallic pendants did. The reference is at the bottom there. In it, Alyssa Whitmore made a cast replica of a phallic pendant from Piercebridge and had her partner wear it. That's the chap in the middle of the screen. While he was doing various different activities. While wearing it, it bounced about on his body, but the shape of it, with a wide base where the testes were, meant that most of the time it returned to a position on his chest and pointing outwards. Naturally, I doubt that all of them could be suspended around the neck like this, but it suggests that when they could be, they literally pointed towards any oncoming supernatural dangers. As Ralph Merrifield suggests this, it was kind of a lightning conductor for bad luck. There are only 20 phallic pendants that derive from stratified and datable contexts in Roman Britain, and they turn up in the 1st century, and they can also be found confidently in the 4th century. Occasionally, you might come across an idea that phallic things are mainly 1st or 2nd century in the literature. As far as my data set makes out, this isn't necessarily true. They were a fairly continuous feature of the whole Romano-British period, these phallic pendants. Not all phallic pendants were erect. In addition to 117 iffy phallic pendants, there are 14, so only about 10%, slightly bit more, in which the phallus was flaccid. As far as we can tell, this isn't actually doing anything different in terms of being a functional amulet, and that was still its function. But the form that it takes is very different. These really are much understudied objects. There is a comparable type to these metal ones that's found in bone on the continent, which comes in a few slightly different variants of these. There's at least some better information about them, where there's 15 examples from 8 sites recorded on the artifacts catalogue. And this type seems to die out by the middle of the 1st century at the latest. So the bone types that may exist on the continent never really made it into Britain. And then we have a follow-on type, which is in copper alloy, but only in very, very small numbers. There is only one flaccid phallic pendant from a stratified context in Britain, and that's from a 3rd to 4th century Roman grave at Catterick, again suggesting this long period of use of the amulet type. In addition to phallic pendants, we also find a lot of phallic mounts. Mounts are always tricky, as they are a class of objects where there is probably lots of slightly different things getting lumped together under the one category. I recorded 113 of them, of which 77 were metal, and the rest of them are made out of bone. It's much the same sort of story as the pendants. They're quite widely distributed over the full Romano-British period, the 1st to 4th centuries, and most of the province, give or take. I think there are probably some trends in the use of the different forms changing over time, but we need much better stratigraphic information to be able to really unpick that. And it's particularly the nature of these things that they don't really turn up in easily datable contexts. The one at the top left is by far the most common type that you'll get, where you have this little phallic stud with the long rivets on the back. It's got a central keel and 2 stylized testes at the base. It's probably going to be attached to some sort of leather strap or harness. Included in that 117 phallic mounts are a group of elongated objects, which include a phallus at one end and a fist making a rude gesture at the other end, the manus feca. This is where the thumb is placed under the forefinger. I call these things mounts as they're clearly attached to something else, but we haven't really bottomed out exactly what. There are 36 of them in bone and 8 of them in copper alloy in Roman Britain. This gesture is sort of rude, sort of lucky. It may have allusions to depicting sexual penetration. These are really interesting things. This fist and phallus combination turns up in some other media, but where it does, it's always like these 2 things together. They kind of tack 2 individually amuletic images together to create one kind of super amulet. It's really interesting. The narrative is quite physically aggressive, and perhaps that's meant to be as a threatening thing against malignant forces. We have them in both bone and copper alloy, and this is one of the very few phallic things that can actually be typologically dated from the mid-1st to mid-2nd centuries AD. It does also turn up in particular on horse harnesses, but I'm not going to go into them. I will direct you towards Mike Bishop's work on horse harness pendants. As we mentioned, bone phallic things, and yes, it's okay to snigger. Stephen is going to be discussing these mad things later on. These are antler burrs with phallic images carved onto them. So they're quite large, and they have between 2 and 4 suspension holes within them, and different types of phallic imagery depicted on the front, but of a type that should now be familiar from the other images that I've had. It's either an iffy phallus or something that is flaccid. I'm not going to dwell on them because Stephen's going to pick up on these things later on. There's a few other smaller groups of things that are likely to be come across either as personal adornment or things that were suspended from something else. There are scattered examples of gold fingerings, I think 4 that are securely from Roman Britain, all of which seem to take this very small form, and all of which were the same sort of simple stylized gold phallus on the bezel. These are not unreasonably assumed to be worn by children, but I don't think there's any contextual evidence to suggest that. It's mainly based on the fact that they're all about 10 millimeters wide or less. Much more interestingly are these completely insane things. Polyphallic tintinnabula, also incredibly rare, like gold finger rings. These things really are bonkers, and they really exemplify the idea that bizarre phallic things were prevalent as amuletic devices. They are wind chimes. They have bells suspended in various arrangements, and of about the 50 or so that we know about, all are individually unique. They're particularly associated with the Mediterranean in the 1st century, and especially Pompeii and Herculaneum. There are a couple of outliers in the northwestern provinces. As far as I've been able to ascertain, none of them are associated with well-stratified and datable contexts in the northwest, and there is only one tentatively and very problematically provenanced one to Britain from Colchester. It isn't this one, unfortunately. This is one of them from Pompeii, but it gives you a sense of these things did exist elsewhere on the continent. Undoubtedly, what is increasingly becoming my favorite type of phallic object is there is a small group of color-coded pedestal cups with phallic decoration depicted on them in Barbary. I've recorded 33 fragments of these from Roman Britain. These are really associated with the local Nene Valley ceramic industry, and so we mostly find them in the Midlands and in the southeast. I think they're fascinating because, unlike most of the phallic objects so far, these things really require you to handle them in order to be able to use it. A lot of the other things are either worn or exist somewhere on a building, but these things you have to hold to be able to do anything with it. It's interesting to consider how you are using them. It requires a very tactile contact with the decoration that isn't true of most other phallic objects. These things also, probably more than anything else, were meant to be funny. There's no doubt that the booze that was going to be consumed out of them might have added to that fact. This property in and of itself has elsewhere been argued to have been a positive, almost amuletic quality. You'll have heard that laughter is the best medicine. Well, there is some literary evidence that this was true of the ancient world. So these weird looking cups have got these interesting kind of sensory properties to them. They look weird. You have to touch them and to be able to use them. There's potential tastes of their contents and auditory sound of sniggering that becomes associated with them as well. Much more research is needed on these things, and if you know of any more, please do tell me about them. Probably the best known example of phallic things in the ancient world generally are carvings. Mostly these are on stone. There are 92 of them in Roman Britain, with a couple on ceramic build materials and one on a large lead alloy weight. On these, do check out Rob Collins's RFG datasheet and the chapter in the Roman Sex volume that I mentioned at the top. There are also a few references on carvings in the blog bibliography noted earlier as well. Phallic carvings come in two forms: relief carvings that were definitely part of the original stone, and incised carvings that were more likely to have been added after the stone was put in place. The relief on the bottom left, incised at the top left. As you can see from the map on the right, they are really strongly associated with large urban settlements, York, Lincoln, and in particular with the Hadrianic frontier. It's not universally true, but these things are quite strongly associated with the military, and they turn up in their forts and fortresses. They also turn up on a few quernstones, on which Ruth is going to introduce further on in the seminar. Occasionally, they turn up on external walls and defences, including on the curtain wall of Hadrian Wall itself and the fortress walls at York. With a more nuanced view, we find them at liminal and boundary spaces, so a line of entrances and exits into buildings, on doorways, thresholds, windows, bridges, and that sort of thing. And conceptually, these are spaces that were particularly in danger from the evil eye. These are potentially very long-lived objects. Once installed on a building, they could be there for years, decades, maybe even centuries in place in a stone building, and that makes them extraordinarily difficult to date, but also undoubtedly one of the longest-lived amulets that we can find any evidence for. There is no suggestion that you need to kind of activate them in any sort of way. You don't need to touch them or have a prayer uttered as you walk past it. I rather suspect that some of them might have been painted, but we have no analyses that have been done on that to my knowledge, in which to kind of make them even more prominent on the stones in which they have been placed. There are a few that appear not on walls, but on the floor and very easily accessible. And I always do like to mention this one. This is in the Principia of Chester's Fort on Hadrian's Wall. The raised circular dais that it sits on represents a really significant trip hazard to the unwary. If you're walking about this thing, it's about 10 centimeters proud of the stone. Maybe there is something in getting guests and tourists to trip over it in the headquarters. I can see Roman soldiers quite liking that as entertainment. It does, however, euphemistically point towards the entrance of the building or towards people gathering in the courtyard. So in the same ways that the reconstructed pendant experiment showed that they can be used to be directed towards elements of potential danger. Unlike something worn or something carried, these carvings work in a slightly different way. They're kind of static guardians of predefined spaces. They protect buildings and places as well as people, but note that there is a difference in the intent of someone consciously choosing to wear an amulet, and also that a carving that was in place whether you wanted it to be there or not. And this difference in intent is also true of the final class of objects I'm going to talk about today, seal boxes. Once again, the RFG datasheets are really handy here. Check out number 4 by Colin Andrews, which includes an introduction to the topic and typological range of them. Most decorated seal box lids include some sort of geometric decoration in enamel, but small numbers do include a miniature phallic mount riveted in place instead. With these, it's only the glands, the head, that includes a small basin of coloured enamel. Why add an amuletic image onto these things? Well, the seal box held a wax impression, which is tied with bindings into something valuable. It can be a bag or a box. So it's a kind of security seal. And the seal box physically protected the contents from being tampered with. The addition of a form of supernatural protection on top of the physical protection seems to make sense. Something that I haven't mentioned, but I need to do so before we end this very whistle-stop tour of phallic things in the Roman world, is a reminder that phallic imagery on objects is only one type of amulet in the Roman world. There are loads of other different amulets, either as powerful images or as powerful materials inscribed with arcane drawings or texts, and the uses of these things often intersected. So despite being common in the Roman archaeological record, they did not exist in isolation from a panoply of other objects. I argue for the idea that different amulet types were probably intended to protect from different sorts of harm at different times and in different places, even if we can't be exactly sure now what those harms were. And this is probably true of all the different sorts of phallic images that I've shown in this quick tour of the type. To reach a very quick summary of this introduction, phallic images were pretty ubiquitous in the Roman world. This one image was powerful and it could be used in a variety of different object types and in different materials to achieve a form of supernatural protection. They were used as adornment on human bodies and probably some animal bodies as well, and could be used to protect physical spaces and places from the effects of the evil eye and other perceptions of supernatural harm in the ancient world. Thank you. Any questions?